to interview Kay Firth Butterfield. She's the head of AI at the World Economic Forum. And we had a conversation around the AI toolkit for boards of directors that the World Economic Forum developed and released earlier this year. Now, that's in very much an effort on their part to start the conversation around good governance with how AI impacts all sectors of society, public, private, rural, all types of economies. And so when we had that conversation, she made an interesting comment. And the comment was, she was the world's first chief AI ethics officer. I found that quite interesting because I didn't know many other people who are AI ethics officers. And there's also not a lot of study or actual qualification programs that are available for you to become an AI ethics officer. So I wrote to her afterwards, and as God should have it, divine intervention, saw an AI ethics program for women based in the US released in March this year, which I applied for. I was accepted and paired with Kay. So Kay is now my mentor, which is, I should say, quite fortuitous because it's allowed me to become part of one of the World Economic Forum projects based in India, which they are now outlining or developing an AI ethics communications framework. So I won't share too many details now, but once my participation in the project has deepened and we have more outcomes, I'll be able to share more. So it's quite exciting times. But I think why we're here tonight is to talk particularly about AI ethics, its place right now in the world, what has been done, and what are we doing in South Africa. If I can, I'll share my screen if that's all right. And Nish, it's so great to see you, by the way. I haven't seen you in ages. So if I can share my screen here, if that's all right.
Can you just share how you'd like to field questions? Would you like people to pop them on the chat or wait till the end?
That's a good point. Please throw your questions into the chat if you'd like. Maybe I can ask the team to assist me with picking up questions if I miss them. But also, if you have a question, raise your hand or come in as we are speaking, because I very much like it to be interactive. And also, the best questions could potentially win some really nice prizes. So we encourage you to ask your questions, please. I just want to locate the actual screen that I'll be sharing. So give me a second, please, while I do that. Okay, here we go. And I need to get to the actual screen. Okay. Thank you for being so patient with me. What I need to do though is get here and share my screen and then be able to take you back. Okay, brilliant. Now I can do that. Please let me know when you can see my screen.
I think we can all see it now, Naz.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Okay, great. So we can kick off, I think. Nishan, can I ask you please to assist me with the timekeeping so I don't go over time?
Sure, no problem, Naz.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, excellent. So I think a nice way to start is we need to have a guide of what we're talking about. Otherwise, it's going to go a bit haywire. And that can happen. So I'd like to briefly talk about today. We can define what AI ethics means, the AI ethics conversations around the world. Because I think if you prepare a framework or you have some understanding of what the landscape is, then we can figure out particular concepts that we need to start interrogating. And I think that's a good way to go. The AI ethics conversation in Africa. And then finally, we can possibly investigate what are some of the questions to increase the AI ethics conversation at home. So I think that's a nice way to flow and we can move from there. So I will move on here. Now, this is one of my favorite parts, right? Because philosophy is, of course, the basis of understanding the concept of ethics and how you are able to articulate it, especially in a space like technology. So I'm going to go ahead right now and ask the question about, I know I have some points there and you can read it, but I would like to know from 2 or 3 people, including our very, very gracious hosts, what do you understand by the term of ethics? Or what does it mean to you? And we will see the benefit of asking people to answer this once you have answered. So maybe Nish, you want to kick off. What does ethics mean to you?
Naz, your screen's still showing your first slide. I'm not sure if you've moved on to your next slide.
I have moved on to my next slide. I'm not sure why it's not moving, but let me get back
There
there.
we go. There you go.
Can you
Cool.
see it now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant.
So if I had to take a stab at this, I think it's about understanding what we're allowed to do and not do when it comes to AI, considering the human impact.
Okay. Thank you. Greg Malson, could I ask you, sir, to give us some indication of what ethics means to you?
I feel ethics are a little bit personal, depending on the company that you're working in. If you're working by yourself, then ethics, I think, are a little bit fashionable, to be honest, like morals.
Yeah.
But I would say that an ethic should be more around what a consensus group would apply as ethical, and we actually need to define them, to be honest.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a great insight. Deshni, if you're on the call, I don't see your surname, so apologies. But what's your brief definition of ethics for yourself?
Hi, Narazeen.
Hi.
So for me, ethics would probably be, if I had to define it, the way you guide basically your principles that guide your behavior and how you'd behave in a certain instance.
Yeah.
It's a bit tricky in my context because the thing is, ethics and law have two different standards. So for me, law could have a certain standard and your ethics could either fall above or below that line. And for me also, the concept of ethics is very subjective. What's my ethical principles are not your ethical principles, so they could be 100%. All over.
Thank you so much, Deshni. That's I like that you use the word subjective, because that's a very, very key criteria point to know once you deal with something like data. I will take one more definition, and I also want to recognize Lavina, who's on the call, Lavina Ramkisum, who's the founder of Tuti AI. Thank you so much for coming onto the call. Lavina is one of the mentors on the program that I am currently a mentee on. So I'm very glad to have some serious leadership on our call this evening. Mlungisi Malinga, can you give us your quick definition of what ethics means to you? No, I don't know if you can hear me.
Ethics to me has to deal with its behavior, which is acceptable in an environment. It's practices and behaviors that are acceptable in an environment.
Okay, thank you. That's good. I like that. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you participating so well. I know it's always a bit nerve-wracking when you're called on from a crowd, but you all did well. So what I heard from all the definitions were principles, a consensus, subjective understanding or subjective viewpoint, and a socially acceptable view on behavior within an environment. And I must use the term socially acceptable, of course, also because it is our company name. But if you look at these particular points that everyone has made, they're all tied together. A consensus or a shared understanding of what works for the greater good. That's generally how you could describe ethics, a type of philosophy that makes sense to a large enough group of people for the betterment of others. Now, when you think about ethics in that way, and I also like what Deshni talked about how subjective it is, and why would that be? It would be subjective because every single one of us on this call have a lens through which we live, and that lens is shaped by culture, religion, and how we see ourselves in the world. Our idea around being an individual versus being part of a family unit or part of a community. those concepts are very much at play in the world right now because of the approach or how people are understanding what it means to wear a mask, especially in the coronavirus pandemic. So if you looked at something as just as small, as simple as the idea of wearing a mask, you can understand so many deep concepts around ethics because it comes down to the value system of what it means to care for someone else. And that value system can very much be informed by who you are as a person, what your upbringing or background teaches you about the codependence or being interdependent versus the individuality or celebration of self. Now, I know those are terms that have philosophical threads around them, and they go deep in terms of thinking who we are and what we are and our entities. However, they tie back very nicely to the idea of AI ethics. Why? Why do we say that? Because, and for me, this is an interesting point. Why am I so pedantic about talking about AI ethics all the time? It's because when I look at the amount of data we produce every day, that data is a culmination of who and what we are. Our behaviors give or signify an indication of our value system. Our value systems guide how we treat people in the world and how we treat ourselves. And because of that, the level of bias or prejudice can be either detrimental or you could say beneficial for whoever it serves. And that, I think, if you look at the chain of how these connect to one another, that is why we can understand ethics in that way. So I thank you all for sharing with me on this slide. I think it was a good way to be able to intro what we understand about ethics. Are there any questions at this stage, or are there any comments that anyone would like to make? I'm not sure how to get an indication of whether that's a yes or no, but if there isn't, then I will move on.
As I have some interesting questions, but I think it might be useful for the Lean Coffee to go through some of them.
Sure, absolutely. No problem, Rochelle. Is there any comment you'd like to make at this stage, though, before we move on? I like the session to be interactive, so please throw anything in you'd like.
Not from me at the moment. Anybody else?
Okay.
Feel free to remember there's a raise hand feature on Zoom. And then you can also use the comments or the chat if you'd like to add your comments.
Okay, brilliant. In that case, we will move on. So AI ethics convos around the world. So what did we do? We defined what AI ethics could potentially mean, or the idea of ethics. And now we want to lay the landscape. So understand global and local movements. And for me, I found some interesting, right? Of course, we don't have an entire session of 3 hours or a whole lecture to go through. So we're going to go through them just in the point forms, just to understand a whole global movement. We've got, and I was part of some of the sessions, which is why this was interesting for me, the EU 12-week public participation process, which started in February, called on members of the community, and you could join, particularly if you were aligned to an organization like the Montreal Institute for AI Ethics, that hosted a number of public participation group sessions in participation with the Partnership on AI based in San Francisco. They called for public participation, understanding how an AI ethics framework can be developed. And if research is done, what factors will determine whether the research is accepted and by whom? Now, those were interesting conversations for us to have, because generally research in this particular area is taken seriously by an academic institution or a body associated with an academic institution. That makes sense, right? They have the necessary capabilities, skill, as well as credentials in order to present information that is accurate, fair, and will provide enough validated data. The other side of that coin was, what if there are civil society organizations or groups interested in the same areas, but can actively participate and impact the process? Organizations like mine, we do not have academic backing, but we can get ethics clearance from the Human Sciences Research Council as an example. So where do you draw the line? And how can I, as a digital citizen of the world, be actively involved in developing those AI ethics frameworks? And that's where the conversations were around. They're currently still busy, of course, with developing the entire paper around these public participation programs. I hear it will be released in 2021 early. Then there was quite a bit of news going around, news headlines, which we know I've only covered a very select portion of them. Vladimir Putin's daughter, Russian president's daughter, was appointed as the head of AI Institute at the Moscow State University earlier this year. I mean, she's a noted physicist and she's doing other great work there, so it made sense. But I read an interesting note about her surname, which is, I can't remember now, but it starts with a K, forgive me for that. I have read that in Russian culture, it is noted that a woman will take the surname of her surname will be that of her father's family name. So if it was, how could we say, Putin or Kudnova, then you will add an A at the end of that surname. And it was interesting to me to understand how you can actually tell someone's surname and align it to where they come from, or their tribe, or whoever their family was, so the familial side of the family. Now that reminds me of the Middle Eastern cultures, where a woman is, sometimes you see the names, and the names are Ibn al-Ahmad or Ibn al-Aslam. It would signify that they belong, the daughter of Ahmed, or the daughter of Rishad, or the daughter of someone. And that's a very interesting way, if you look at the culture of how people are attributed certain characteristics in terms of being a human being. If I thought about how AI systems or algorithms are going to read that data and how we can train them to do so, that's a very particular conversation. And also, what does it mean if it can read that information? How will it determine allocating dignity to that person? That is I know we have to go deeper into that, but that for me was an interesting question. The next was, I've also found this quite interesting. Pope Francis has 1 billion followers in terms of Catholic people of the Catholic faith, and he joined forces with IBM and Microsoft to develop ethics for AI. He sees the value of it. He understands that it is very much part of the way you can understand faith. Now, how incredibly interesting is the concept where a lot of people who are interested in the concept of science to explain things now cross over to bring faith into the conversation. Something for us to consider. Then the sector deal for AI in the UK is actually a paper or a series of ideas that was presented in the House of Lords, I think it was. I know a lady who helped write the paper on AI, Chrissy Lightfoot. She's an AI ethics lawyer. And their idea there is similar to what the US is also doing, which is to present principles or pillars around how AI will be developed for the good of its citizens and building a digital economy. The similar ideas are maintained in the executive order that Trump put out, which is maintaining American leadership in AI. This had 5 principles. I just want to look at them, 5 pillars, which was around investing in AI research, making federal AI resources more available, setting standards for AI, and training an AI workforce, as well as promoting pro-innovation international environment. Now, the last one, I don't know how effective that's going to be, considering Trump has effectively said that TikTok needs to be out of the US and Microsoft is busy trying to acquire them. So if his political might is around getting as many people or countries whose foreign policies he doesn't agree with out of there, I don't know how the pro-innovation with international partners is going to work. But I suppose we're going to see, right? And then finally, the Pentagon also revealed their 5 ethical principles for AI in warfare. And you can go and read up more on that. I just put in the Alan Turing Institute and Ada Lovelace Institute because globally, their names, including other institutions, like the Center for Future Innovation at Cambridge University, who work together and are prominent voices when developing these papers or research ideas around AI ethics. So it's important to understand the landscape in terms of government output, and then you have academia, and you've got the actual tech conglomerates of the private sector, who we all know we use their services on a daily basis, that are pulling and pushing at the same time to try and lead in the race to be the next AI champion. I'm going to move on here, and then Nish, if you can tell me if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So before we move on to get to the international landscape, and I know I started at 5:30, so I have about 15 minutes or maybe 10 before we get to questions. Am I right? I think pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. These are just some of the questions as part of socially acceptable's beginning stages in terms of developing research. We released a 12-part AI article series at the end of 2018. And part of the series, one of the articles was around AI ethics. And these are some of the questions that we explored, or we can ask. And I would like you we'll go through some of them, but I would like you to consider them when you are doing your own thinking around what it means to understand AI ethics. So I'll just read through 3 of them, and we won't talk in depth because we need to move on, but we can understand, I think, for future reference, to explore them a little bit more. How does morality or ethics get conveyed into a mathematical format for logical consumption? Who owns the decision made on the ethical use of AI in global applications that affects humanity? How is bias prevented in system development, or if at all? These are very big questions, and they demand interrogation that calls on every sector of society, including understanding what a society comprises. And in the South African context, it is deep, rich, and vibrant because we are multicultural, multilingual, various faiths and beliefs, ideas around spirituality, ideas around gender. And that too can be said for the rest of the world, but South Africa, as is Africa, is a particular example. And so I think, as well as our challenges here in terms of socioeconomic challenges that we face, are pretty much quite different from the rest of the world. So when we answer these questions, it's through that particular lens that we want to answer those questions. I'll move on, if I may. And we'll come back to the slide when we get to what questions should we be asking to continue the conversation on AI ethics. I'll move on here. Okay, so we got a sense of what the global movement is like. And I think I said this to you, Nish, talking about what's happening globally. But in quite a few of the sessions I've attended from the African perspective, so me and a few other people who represent the African contingent attended international UK, Europe, as well as US-based webinars around understanding AI ethics policies and development of new papers to guide the principles of how AI ethics should work. The African perspective was either missing or not well informed, or there wasn't very much information. So that for me was of particular interest. But it does not mean that Africa is not moving, right? Earlier this year, when President Cyril Ramaphosa became the chairperson of the African Union, he called for the establishment of an AI institute, or an AI center that will help move along the fourth industrial revolution. You know that we have the Presidential Commission on 4IR. While we work in our individual sectors and professions, developing in a personal or private sector capacity, the Presidential Commission on 4IR, I do believe for South Africa, hopes to in some way move forward how South Africa responds to the challenge for 4IR. Now, we have many challenges here currently, physical, socioeconomic, political, personal challenges in terms of how citizens participate in the process. We have expensive data costs, not enough good infrastructure that can serve citizens even if they had the correct mobile or devices to be able to connect to a network. The literacy rate is also another issue, as is the political debate on how resources are shared. Now, while we look at those things, we still support the work of the Presidential Commission for OIR because we need to add the diversity of voices. And what does that mean? That means that while policymakers sit on that particular commission, it is our responsibility as representatives of various organizations, whether we work in private sector or we are civil society organizations, even the man on the street, no matter who you are, your data is always at the mercy of the networks that you use or any particular platform that you are using to live your life, to be able to participate in society. There's got to be a point where you are able to have a voice about how that society or that participation works, and it should be equitable. To this end, to help the process, there are some movements in Africa at the moment. We told you about the AI, or rather the AU's call with President Cyril Ramaphosa asking for the an AI African Center. But Google has established an AI lab in Ghana. Microsoft has an AI lab in Kenya. And just a few days ago, I think it's in the Free State, Central University of Technology, CUT, together with Kijima, which is one of, I think, South Africa's largest training organizations, established an AI university, Microsoft AI University program, which I am still exploring because it's fairly new, so we will see. It will be open for public consumption in the next, I think in the next year or so, once they've tested how well it works with a team of people that they're trialing it with. So these are interesting happenings that are going on in Africa. I know that the POPI Act was enforced from the 1st of July this year, which regulates South Africans, the use of South Africans' personal data. There are other countries on the continent, like Ghana, who are establishing their personal protection bills at the moment. I don't know yet if most of them have been passed and to what effect and degree, but with South Africa, we have a year for implementation, which means that come 2021, there could be a potential of up to 10 million Rand for a fine, but the information regulator hasn't said how they will regulate this process. In all of that that's happening, do we hear about the conversation for AI ethics? Are we hearing that? And do we understand how our data is used? Do we know if and when the innovation that's being applied in other countries will also be applied here? POPI is, for most of part, rip and replace of GDPR, for most part. Are we waiting on the EU, the US, and the UK to come up with these principles and then align ourselves? Or are we already starting to plan how we move forward, what we think about, given the context of being African? No matter what color we are, what language we speak, or where our ancestors came from, if they were brought here as slaves, I know we were just talking about this today. Our ancestors or our forefathers as Indian people, I'm of Indian descent, were brought to Durban, South Africa as indentured laborers, slaves to the sugarcane fields. But I am South African. Although my cultural preference is different, I have a different home language. My language, English, is my first language. So taking into account, if I myself have so many facets as a Muslim woman, as a woman of color, South African, with some Indian roots, and whatever else, and I seem to have a love for Spanish, I don't know why. But taking into account all of these things, then you look at the other states that we have. Do we have 52 or 54 countries in Africa? If somebody can help me, I don't remember. But taking into account the 50 plus states or countries we have in Africa, how then are we going to effectively direct the questions around AI ethics, which is why we asked the question in the previous slide, right? So those are some things to think about. And if I move on here, I just want to look at what the last slide is here so that I know whether we are. So how do we increase the AI ethics focus here at home? And I think we sort of wrapped that up in the last few words that we have. So I'm going to share some of those questions in the chat and leave you with something to think about. But I would also encourage you to please reach out, naz@sociallyacceptable.co.za, and email me. I'd love to have more chat with you and explore and understand this. And please join our research team. Reach out to me, and I'd love for you to join the research team should you have any interest in AI ethics. Thanks, everybody. We'll take time for questions, I think.
Thank you, Naz. That was very insightful. I definitely learned a lot about ethics in terms of AI in the African context, and definitely we need to get our voice heard if we're going to make a difference in terms of what AI does in Africa. There's a couple of questions and comments in the chat, Naz. Greg, I'm not sure if you want to speak up or you'd like Naz just to read up on your question.
Oh, I see. I do see the questions here. Sorry, guys, I haven't seen the questions. I was looking through. When you're doing the screen share, it sort of blocks everything out. I'll start at the top. I'm just scrolling up to the top. So I see, okay. Ethics, acceptable standards of practice and environment. Mungesi put in a comment. Ashish, ethics probably considering the sensibilities of all parties involved. Hello, Lavina. Devali Neertling, speaking to the subjective nature of ethics, a thought experiment. Thank you for sharing the links. This is so cool because, of course, it sparks more thought and it gives us more case studies which we can look at.
Yeah, cool.
I think these are the Pentagon AI principles. Thanks, Devalius, for posting them. Those are really cool because people can check them out. Greg, should the data that is powering AI be made more available in controlled manner or made freely available? Where should AI development stop? How will AI affect the children? So I have very deep questions. You have a deep mind, sir. We need a little bit of time to answer this, and I'm sure we can get answers from the rest of the team. But from my perspective, if I may offer a quick answer, I'll answer the first one. Should the data that is powering AI be made more available in a controlled manner or made freely available? There's a teenager in Germany who recently took a system that was developed by a large organization. I don't remember now. And he wanted to demonstrate how releasing that set of data that they had put out about an AI system they wanted to build could be for the worse, not for the better. He was actually on the call with the Montreal Institute of AI Ethics. I will find the link and send it to the guys at AIZA so they can send it to you on their next newsletter or emails that they send out. It's a good case study of why I believe it should be controlled to a certain extent. Data that's powering AI should be made available in the instances when it needs to be go through the cleaning process so that we understand the level, I believe, the high level of bias or whatever may inform it that will have a negative output. Because we need to have bias, right? Bias is an inherent part of who we are as human beings. Without bias, we're not able to make the effective decisions we do make. So the bias is necessary, but we have to, I do believe, and this is a evolving daily conversation to understand what bias is and how it will work. An example, a Muslim woman with a scarf like this, or however a Muslim woman ties a hijab, I'm just using a local example because I know it. If she goes to an interview, a person sees her with a headscarf. She may not be given a job because of the association with the headscarf. But if a robot like Furhat Robotics in Sweden applies their recruitment system through their robot to interview the woman, the robot doesn't see the scarf, they see her credentials. The same with people who have different genders, the same with people who have different ideas around how they want to culturally appear. So I think my perspective, and there are varying perspectives in this, should the data that is powering AI be made more available in a controlled manner or made freely available? Made available in a more controlled manner under a particular set of criteria. Again, what is that criteria? I don't know. We have to talk about that. We'll move on. Lavina, for our AI dialogue, for SA, urge everyone to be part of dialogue. Thank you so much. I'm also going to check out that link, Lavina. Christopher, have to run, but thanks for the insightful talk. See you on the metaphorical machine learning trolley. Yes, we won't go off our trolleys, but we'll certainly be on it for the long ride. Okay, Gilad, if I'm saying your name correctly. My question is regarding the transparency in AI decision-making. Considering the buzz surrounding deep learning, I often feel as if it is a very black box. In some cases, the researchers who create said technology do not fully understand what is happening behind the scenes. The inner workings of these systems is often obscured by jargon and buzzwords, but that could be my ignorance on the topic speaking. Should unexplained, inexplicable systems be unacceptable as a whole? So it's a good question, Gilad. I think there's two parts here, quickly. The people who build or fund the systems may not always necessarily have an understanding of the articulation of the frameworks that inform the systems, but the developers do. So it's like Rupert Murdoch owning a number of media houses. He has one agenda, the journalists have another agenda. And where do you draw the fine line on media freedom and the public's right to know? The same analogy can be used in terms of AI ethics, I do believe. So your question is very valid, and it talks to this particular analogy, I think. Are they only acceptable in low risk situations where the possible harm is minimal? Again, I say it requires whatever AI ethics framework we set for South Africa, for the African continent, is based upon an agreed widespread understanding of the continent as a whole, with them merely being guidelines and used on a case-by-case basis, which I suppose is how it works in many other instances. Then we have, this username is very interesting, and I'm so sorry. It starts with Pam, so I'm going to call you Pam. I'm so sorry, I can't read it out. It's quite a long one. So in essence, it's not about the data, but the other model, rather the other model. I think that's a developer question. Please help me to understand what you are saying. But my perspective as an AI ethics practitioner is, it is about the data, because my thought, and I keep thinking about this, the more I think about data, the more it is a representation of who we are. The who we are is the characteristics, our values, our beliefs. And the more we keep feeding a system this particular data, if there is a higher level of prejudice that currently exists in the world, then that's what the output is going to be, right? So it's all about the data, I feel, but maybe I misunderstood your question. So I'm very sorry, and please ask it again. De Villiers says garbage in, garbage out. It's 100% true. Gilad, no problem with the clarification. Pambos, not other, but rather. Yes.
Excuse me, may I interrupt quickly?
Yes, please. I don't know who that is.
That's De Villiers.
Ah.
Yes, I think I can give you a developer insight on Pambos's concern there. He's saying essentially it's not so much about the data, but rather the model. So what he's saying is, we can generate data all we like, and then the ethics more comes in with what should we do with this data, because the models, as in the AI, are basically just little bots running. They don't have feelings and thoughts and ethical concerns.
Hold on, De Villiers. This is Pambos. You are absolutely right. It's not about the data. The data is going to be manipulated one way or another.
Exactly.
The model has biases and preconceived ideas which were introduced by the developer, either knowingly or unknowingly. The data is going to be handled according to those biases. And if there's no ethics in developing that model, you can put whatever data you want. You're going to get garbage out. That's why I'm saying it's rather the model, not the data. Thanks.
There's actually a practical example. Sorry to interrupt again. I'll find the link now where you can see the ramification. It speaks exactly to this problem, because it concerns basically identifying culprits or criminals in the United States. So it turns out that they identified Black people overwhelmingly more than anybody else. So now the question is this a case of we have garbage data going in there? Is it a case of bias from the developers? Is it a case of that is reflecting the real situation? It becomes an ethical concern then, not so much a technological problem to solve.
Yeah. Let's take another example. There's a self-driving car which essentially gets into an accident. And the options are either to drive towards the other lane or get onto the pavement. Now there's a kid there and there's an old man in the car coming from the opposite direction. Which way does the car go? Does it go towards the kid? Does it go towards, the data is the data. The model has to make the decision. Data is not going to change. So the bias you introduce, if you say, well, he's 65, he lived his life, let me save the kid. If that's the approach the model is going to take, it's going to be one decision. So it depends on the model rather than the data. The data say it's objective. It is what it is. You cannot change it. That's the bias which is coming into the model.
Yes, I was actually looking for that example as well because I'm aware of it. And
yeah.
I think it was in China, the cultural bias was towards saving the old people, whereas in the West, the bias was more towards saving the younger people because you think like the young people still have a shot and the old people have had their life. So I couldn't find the link now, but I was actually looking for that example as well.
Can I maybe also add a comment on this? In the sense that, I mean, it does come from, like, biases doesn't just come from one or the other. It does come from both. Because it matters what is in the data and how we use that data. Because, as you said, we transform that data anyways, but how we transform that data could add our own biases based on what we understand is in the data, but it also could fix biases in the data. And there's a lot of things within the model that we still don't understand. It's still a growing technology. So while we might assume things that the model is picking up on or how it's learning, we might not be correct about it right now. In a year's time, in a month's time even, with the rate that things are growing, our understanding of how neural networks work or how machine learning and AI works in a general sense could change completely. That's how in flux I feel AI is at the moment. It's not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing because we're constantly learning new things of how to learn, essentially, how to get machines to learn from data. Because as we give it data, essentially, if you compare it to how we as humans learn, we learn from our experiences. We learn from what we experience every single day, and we build on our knowledge. We correct ourselves as we go along. Whereas with the AI, you're giving it the data and say, yeah, learn everything you can from this data. It doesn't have a lot of time to actually correct itself. We have to do that. We currently do that manually by having to assess the data, by understanding, is there biases in the data and how should we be fixing that? So it's still, I think, a very open thing that you have to be considerate about the implications of what you're doing at each step of the process, not just when you're working with the data or when you're building the model. At every step of the process, you should have some consideration of what the impact and implication of maybe removing a field, removing a value is going to have on the final model. And it's just more about knowing and understanding what the implication of what you're doing is, rather than just giving data to a model and say, here, there's the output kind of thing.
And hence the need for AI ethics, because those ethics are going to tell you which of the characteristics of the data you should take into account and which you shouldn't.
Exactly.
Example, skin color, racial connotations, ethnicity, sex, age, educational levels. Otherwise, why do you take out this field and not the other field in your training data? And hence the reason for AI ethics.
Yeah, precisely.
Hi guys, if I may just add, but I hear the points that people are making. It's Dash. I hear the points that people are making, and it's 100%. I'm actually doing a talk for Girl Code ZA next week, but that's on diversity and inclusion in AI models. But we're all this talk around data, but the essence for me is what we want the algorithm to do, right? Because it doesn't help. You can feed it any data you want and then say the data is biased. But if the outcome of the algorithm, or the purpose of the ultimate purpose of the algorithm, and say the algorithm was predicting a successful hire, you could feed it all the data you want, but unless you determine what the outcome is of the algorithm, what you want the outcome to be for that algorithm, and what is your success factor. So we create this algorithm and we say, okay, our success factor is that in a hiring model, we need a person with these qualifications who are maybe doing 4 years, or, you know, we look at Google and we say, okay, all the people that were successful at Google, they had these critical factors, so we'll use these as a measure of success. And then we'll look at an algorithm that will predict all the people coming in that could have these measures of success. Again, what you're looking for then, irrespective of what the data set is that you've asked the algorithm to create a specific output for you. So based on the data that you feed it, it's going to search for points that gives it the outcome that it needs. So it's the data factor, and the data that we feed it, the training sets of the data, is one thing, insofar as yes, it may be biased, and yes, it may not be biased, but the outcome that you're searching for means that anything that you feed it, it's going to take from that and search for those outcomes. So in my mind, you're actually looking at whether the outcome or your success factor of the algorithm itself is also ethical and fair, versus just looking at the data sets that you're giving it and saying, well, the algorithm outcome is right, the data must be wrong. So for me, it's a twofold factor. It's not just the data sets that you're feeding it, but what you want it to achieve with those data sets.
And that goes back to my point about the model rather than the data. Anyway.
So you know what I love about this?
I didn't hear that, sorry.
No, I think what Pamba said is, it goes back to his point about it being the model being the determining factor around, and of course, Deshni, then you said the outcomes. So this is exciting for me because I'm now interrogating further the components of how systems are built, the people that are responsible or involved for building those systems, and which parts do we need to actually focus on, include or exclude. And what we've gotten from this conversation is you have the model, you have the team building it, you've got the outcomes, and you have particular data sets. Are there other factors that will inform what you want to do, build, or address as a challenge? And which of those points need to be included in feeding a set of AI ethics guidelines, or having the conversation, or interrogating it at that moment? And do you do it again? Do you revisit it once you've had the outcome session and this system is now working to serve a certain group of people? So you've all enriched me to no measure beyond, because I took away so much more than I came into this session with, and I really thank you for that. Thomas, you made a good point. The recent challenge accepted thing that's been going on social media, I even did it, my God, and I don't even post selfies. I don't like that thing of posting selfies, but women around the world were doing it for a good cause, posting a black and white photo, which I have since learned is a Turkish societal practice when a woman is harmed or killed to show that she's gone missing online. I hope I've explained that correctly. But what my thought process was is, if Instagram had, like, on one day 4 million uses of the hashtag, which should effectively equate to 4 million photos being used, I think, or less or more, then how are they actually determining skin color? I mean, if they're using these images, can the algorithm read a filter? And if it can, how can it determine skin tone to determine race? So that was interesting. So one woman said to me online, oh, but it can read names surely. And I said to the woman, well, Salma Patel and Salma Hayek are, of course, two different people and two different backgrounds and ethnicities. So there we go. We have so much more to talk about and think about. But I really appreciate and thank everyone who took time to ask the questions, Pambos, the Villiers, and so many other names that I see here. Marshall, who reached out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you for attending. Deshni, Greg, Gilad, Ashish, Paula. And I don't see other names, but I'm sorry if I missed it. And to everyone who has hosted me, Nishan, Rishal, and the other gentlemen.